Hello friends, today's exercise is about limiting reagent. What is limiting reagent? Limiting reagent is the reactant that is first used up in a chemical process. Once that reactant is used up, the reaction stops. As such, the limiting reagent determines the amount of the product you get in a chemical process. Determination of the limiting reagent involves the application of mole, and as such, you begin with a chemical equation. Now, in a chemical process, 0.5 mole of hydrochloric acid, HCl, reacted with 0.3 mole of sodium hydroxide, NaOH, to form sodium chloride, NaCl, and water, H2O. Now, here are the questions. Which of the reactants is the limiting reagent? The second question, which of the reactants is in excess? The third question, how many moles of the salt are produced? And lastly, how many moles of the excess reagent are left? We have seen that hydrochloric acid reacted with sodium hydroxide to give you sodium chloride and water. You present this statement in a chemical equation. So you have hydrochloric acid plus sodium hydroxide will give you sodium chloride and water. That is the first step. The next step is to make sure that the equation is balanced. On the left of the arrow, you have 2 atoms of hydrogen. On the right of the arrow, you have 2 atoms of hydrogen, so hydrogen is balanced. On the left of the arrow, you have 1 atom of chlorine. On the right of the arrow, you have 1 atom of chlorine, so chlorine is balanced. On the left of the arrow, you have 1 atom of sodium. On the right of the arrow, you have 1 atom of sodium, so sodium is balanced. On the left of the arrow, you have 1 atom of oxygen, and on the right of the arrow, you have 1 atom of the oxygen. So oxygen is balanced. Therefore, the entire equation is balanced. Now, from this equation, you have that 1 mole of HCl reacted with 1 mole of sodium hydroxide to give you 1 mole of sodium chloride and 1 mole of water. The mole ratios of the reactants and the products are 1:1:1. This means that if you have 1 mole of hydrochloric acid, it will require 1 mole of sodium hydroxide to give you 1 mole of sodium chloride and 1 mole of water. Now, in the statement, we have 0.5 mole of hydrochloric acid and 0.3 mole of sodium hydroxide. Then you ask yourself whether this is consistent with this ratio. Of course not. If you have 0.5 mole of hydrochloric acid, you will need 0.5 mole of sodium hydroxide to give you 0.5 mole of sodium chloride and 0.5 mole of water. But it is not the case. We were giving 0.5 mole hydrochloric acid and 0.3 mole of sodium hydroxide. Then we need to determine the number of moles of sodium chloride, because sodium chloride is of interest here. We said that limiting reagent is the reactant that is first used up in a chemical process. Limiting reagent is also the reactant that has the least number of moles involved in a chemical process. Now, from the mole ratio, 1:1:1:1, compare it with this mole ratio, 0.5:0.3. This mole ratio is not consistent with this because sodium hydroxide has the least number of moles, 0.3. Sodium hydroxide is the limiting reagent. And as such, it means that 0.3 moles of sodium hydroxide would require 0.3 moles of hydrochloric acid to give you 0.3 mole of sodium chloride and of course 0.3 mole of water. In question A, sodium hydroxide is the limiting reagent. Now A, sodium hydroxide is the limiting reagent. Now B, when you have two reactants in which one is the limiting reagent, then the other one must be the excess reagent. So B, hydrochloric acid is the excess reagent. Now see, how many moles of the source are produced? The number of moles of source produced depends on the limiting reagent. And because the number of moles of the sodium chloride produced must be consistent with the mole ratio. If the limiting reagent is 0.3, then the number of moles of the sodium chloride produced will also be 0.3. So, the number of moles of the salt produced is 0.3 moles. And then the last question, how many moles of the excess reagent are left? 0.3 mole of sodium hydroxide would require 0.3 mole of hydrochloric acid. So the amount of excess reagent left would be 0.5 mole minus 0.3 mole, and that would give you 0.2 mole. So 0.2 mole, so 0.2 mole of the excess reagent, hydrochloric acid, would be left. In the next exercise, we are going to look into another problem, but this time involving different number of moles of reactants and products in a chemical equation. Thank you very much, and see you next time.